For 7 years, Microsoft Azure was the only legal place to run OpenAI's flagship models. That ended at the end of April 2026. OpenAI signed a $138 billion compute deal with Amazon. Microsoft lost its exclusivity, its right of first refusal, and its AGI clause. GPT 5.5 launched on Bedrock the next day. The most valuable AI rental arrangement in history just got broken open, and the three cloud landlords, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, are now playing three completely different games. One sells access to every floor, one just lost the main tenant, one owns the whole building. This is episode 3 of the AI Money Flow. Before we get to the landlords, the AI rental market in 2026 is worth roughly $40 to $50 billion in cloud AI services revenue, growing about 100% per year. That is on top of the $725 billion in CapEx we covered in episode 1. But the three hyperscalers aren't selling the same product. AWS Bedrock is a marketplace. Customers pick from OpenAI, Anthropic, Meta, Mistral, AI21, Cohere, and now GPT-5, and pay AWS a per-token fee. AWS doesn't care which model wins. AWS rents the floors. Azure OpenAI was an exclusive penthouse. Microsoft paid OpenAI billions in equity and compute for 7 years of legal exclusivity. The penthouse just opened up to all comers. Azure now competes on the rest of its stack. Office 365 Copilot, GitHub, Dynamics, instead of model exclusivity. Google Cloud Vertex is fully vertically integrated. TPU Silicon, Gemini models, Vertex serving, all built in-house. Google sells competitors' models too, Anthropic, Llama. But the margin on Gemini is structurally higher because Google owns every layer. 3 landlords, 3 rent models, 3 completely different unit economics. AWS Bedrock is the youngest of the 3, the smallest by revenue and now the most strategically valuable. Bedrock revenue is approaching $10 billion at run rate by the end of 2026. That is 3 times what it was a year earlier. The growth is driven entirely by model variety. Every major model lab eventually ends up on Bedrock because AWS controls the largest enterprise compute footprint. The April 2026 OpenAI deal is the headline. $138 billion in committed compute over 8 years, plus a $50 billion equity stake from Amazon. GPT 5.5 and GPT 5.4 went into Bedrock preview the day after Microsoft's exclusivity ended. The strategic logic is clean. AWS doesn't need to win the model war. AWS needs the model war to keep happening. Every new frontier model, Anthropic Claude 5, Mistral Large, Llama 4, adds another reason for an enterprise to buy compute through Bedrock instead of trying to host on premises. The margin profile is thinner than Azure's first-party take. Bedrock collects roughly 30 to 35% gross margin on token traffic, versus Azure's effective margin closer to 50 when it controls the model. But Bedrock's scale advantage is structural. Every model on Bedrock pays AWS for compute, while only OpenAI pays Azure. The risk for AWS is not commoditization. Commoditization helps the marketplace. The risk is reliability and latency, the 2 operational dimensions where AWS competes with itself. If a Bedrock customer can't get tokens at the speed they need, they migrate to Azure or Google. Compute is the moat, model variety is the floor, AWS rents the floors, the more tenants, the better. Azure had the most valuable rental arrangement in technology history, and just lost the legal moat that defined it. For 7 years, Microsoft was the only hyperscaler legally allowed to host OpenAI's models. Microsoft invested $13 billion cumulatively for that privilege. Azure OpenAI service became the default enterprise procurement path for GPT. Every Fortune 500 company that wanted to deploy GPT in production did it through Azure. That ended on April 28, 2026. The amended restructuring agreement explicitly cleared OpenAI to run on additional clouds once exclusivity lapsed. Microsoft now has a non-exclusive license, no right of first refusal on new compute, and no exclusivity on future models. The Azure AI business is still the largest by revenue. Microsoft reports a $37 billion AI run rate, Though that number bundles compute, services, and office integration, the pure Azure OpenAI service piece is probably 10 to 15 billion of that. What changes from here? Three things. One, the procurement default breaks. New enterprise GPT deployments will increasingly be a multi-cloud RFP. Azure's win rate drops from near 100% to maybe 60. Two, Azure's remaining moat is distribution, not exclusivity. Office 365 Copilot has over 20 million paid seats. GitHub Copilot adds 2 million. That's 3 to 5 billion in adjacent AI revenue that Bedrock cannot directly replicate. 3. Microsoft is hedging. Mistral, Meta, and Anthropic models are all now first class on Azure too. The exclusivity arrangement is replaced by a marketplace that mirrors Bedrock, except Azure also has Office on top. Azure had the penthouse. Now it sells real estate plus the building's amenities. Google is the smallest of the three by external AI revenue. Vertex AI is probably $5 to $8 billion annualized, but structurally the most interesting. Google does not rent. Google built the building, owns the silicon, makes the materials, and lives on the top floor. The vertical stack, TPU silicon designed in-house, Gemini models trained in-house, JAX framework owned in-house, Vertex serving platform owned in-house, gives Google the lowest marginal cost per token of any frontier lab. Some estimates put Google's effective inference cost at 30 to 40% below what AWS pays NVIDIA for equivalent compute. That margin advantage is not visible on the price list, but it is real on the bottom line. What this enables, three things. One, Gemini is offered at price points the other CSPs can't match for the same quality. Gemini 2.5 Flash at 20 cents per million tokens output is well below GPT-5 Mini at 60 cents. That gap is supply chain economics, not lost leadership. 2. Vertex hosts competitor models too, Anthropic, Llama, Mistral, but the margin Google captures is the rent plus the silicon spread. Hosting on Vertex means paying Google for both the platform and the compute, even when the model isn't theirs. 3. Google is the only frontier lab that doesn't have to choose between owning the model and owning the customer. Search has the customers, Workspace has the enterprise, Android has the device. The lab doesn't need to win on viral consumer apps to maintain its inference business. Google rents floors too, but Google also owns the foundation, the elevator, and the steel. For the enterprise buyer, the three rental models translate into three completely different procurement experiences. If you buy through AWS Bedrock, you get model variety as the headline feature. You can route the same agent workflow through Claude for reasoning, GPT-5 for general, Llama for offline, and Mistral for low-cost backend, all behind one API, one bill, one IAM policy. You pay AWS a per-token premium for the privilege. The contract is portable. You can leave by changing the inference endpoint URL. If you buy through Azure OpenAI, you get integration depth. Your tokens, your data residency, your Microsoft Entra IDs, and your Power Platform connectors all live in one tenant. The cost looks competitive on the surface, but it includes Office Copilot value you would have paid for separately. The contract has lock-in through identity, not through the model. If you buy through Google Vertex, you get silicon economics. Gemini's per-token price is structurally lower because Google's TPU stack delivers cheaper compute. You also get the lowest reliability concern because Google has been running TPU production workloads for 10 years. The contract is technically portable, but Vertex's grounding integration with BigQuery and cloud storage is sticky in a way the other CSPs don't replicate. What this means in practice: enterprises increasingly do not pick one CSP. They pick a primary and a secondary. The CSP that wins long-term is the one with the lowest combined cost across the agent loop: model inference, vector retrieval, observability, evaluation, data residency. That is exactly the dimension where the three CSPs are competing. Token price is the headline. Total cost of ownership is the actual bill. So who wins among the three landlords? The honest answer is each wins a different segment of the market. Let me rank them on three axes: revenue, structural margin, and 2030 moat. On revenue, Azure wins today. $37 billion total AI run rate. Office distribution is a moat that takes a decade to replicate. Even after losing exclusivity, Azure's enterprise procurement default keeps it the largest cloud AI revenue line through 2027. On structural margin, Google wins. The TPU stack delivers a 30 to 40% gross margin advantage over rental NVIDIA on every Gemini token. As Vertex revenue scales, that margin compounds into a P&L line nobody else can match. On 2030 moat, AWS wins. The marketplace model gets stronger as the model wars commoditize. Every new lab, and there will be more, adds another customer to Bedrock without AWS doing anything different. The end state of token economics is commoditization, and AWS is positioned for that better than anyone. And the unanimous winner, the same as episode 1, is the enterprise buyer. The CSP rivalry forces token prices down structurally. AWS competes with Azure on price. Azure competes with Google on price. Google competes with all of them on absolute cost. The buyer captures the spread. The losers, there are two. First-party model labs that don't own a cloud. OpenAI is the biggest example, despite the AWS partnership. Second, every enterprise that signed a long-term Azure OpenAI contract before April 2026. That procurement decision just got repriced. Net of all this, the rental market consolidates over 3 to 4 years into a 3 CSP equilibrium with overlapping marketplaces. The CSP wars will look like the AWS Azure GCP infrastructure wars of the 2010s, just with model-shaped rent on top. Next episode in the AI money flow goes back to the model layer, and the company everyone assumes is the unambiguous winner of all of this. NVIDIA. NVIDIA sold the GPUs. NVIDIA captured every dollar of the $725 billion in 2026 CAPEX. And NVIDIA's customers, AWS, Azure, Google, Meta, and the model labs, are now spending $40 billion building NVIDIA replacements. Trainium, Maya, TPU, MTIA. Why is the most valuable hardware company in the world also the most vulnerable? And what does the unit economics actually look like when the customer becomes the competitor? That's episode 4 of the AI money flow. If you want the actual industry view on where AI money flows, not the headline, not the narrative, the actual P&L, subscribe and stay with this playlist. 6 episodes. One question, who actually profits? This is VLSI Tech Explained.